Stryber.
Yeah. So how would you say, like, if they're thinking about we could buy maybe a startup or we could start a venture within, what would be the thing that you would tell them that they would say, okay, we'll take you. You're a better options for us?
So I probably wouldn't make a pitch to anyone to say that venture building is the better option. If there's the right target out there for you at the right price that strategically fits kind of with what you want to do, that is going to create significant upside for you in terms of revenues, EBITDA in the long term, M&A is a great option. And sometimes, or most of the times, I would say even the preferred option. The problem is the availability of targets and the costs of targets often, right? You don't necessarily find what you need, what you want, what aligns perfectly with your vision, with your strategic goals, with the search fields you're active in. And then even if you do, getting that for a price that is acceptable is very much a tricky one, right? And then venture building is the best alternative, because with venture building, you can build those businesses from scratch. It's usually cheaper than the M&A route, and it's available to basically everyone, right? Yes, you need a significant budget behind it, and you need significant commitment behind it, but it is something that is available for everyone. Everyone can do it, and the upside to venture building really is that you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what kind of models you want to build out, what kind of models you want to invest in, and you have full control over killing projects that don't deliver as they're supposed to, and focusing and doubling down on the ones that you find most promising.
But wouldn't you say that when you are purchasing a startup and you're doing this M&A, in many cases they don't succeed because they think that they buy a solution, and actually the people are trying to, at the beginning they want to join to your big corporates, and afterwards they are leaving because you cannot really give them what they want, and you cannot really grow it within your current system and organization. And in many cases, these M&As are not as successful as they expected them to be. And sometimes it's disappointing for them.
No, and it depends very much on the goals, and it depends on setting the right expectations, right? So M&A sometimes has the goal of saying, look, we want to buy this young startup to become more innovative as a company, and to get their culture assimilated to ours, and to make everyone here at our company more innovative. That usually doesn't work like that. If you buy a startup, especially if it's relatively young still, what you should do is probably keep it relatively separate from your core organization, let it grow its own course. Yes, leverage the assets that you can leverage out of the core organization to give that startup or that venture an advantage that it wouldn't have had it continued on its own. But you can't expect the startup to change kind of the overall culture of your company. If that's the goal, it's probably in many cases not the right way of going about it. Right? And yes, the other side of the coin is also a tricky one. How do you make the startup employees? How do you keep them happy in kind of where they are and so on, right? And this is a tricky one also, and that depends a lot on expectations management. And yes, there are a lot of examples where M&A transactions weren't successful, but there's also examples of companies that are doing it very successfully. And yes, of course, kind of the usual innovative suspects are amongst them, the Amazons and the Facebooks and so on. But there's also companies that have proven themselves to be very good at that, where you wouldn't have necessarily expected it. And Walmart is one of them, right? Walmart has actually managed to reposition, reinvent the whole organization in some way by the many acquisitions they've done, and by the good job they've done integrating them to the right extent at the right time. So yes, obviously it doesn't always work, and there's a lot of things that need to be considered before making acquisitions, but it can be a very promising route as well.
So what is the most important element of venture building?
I think there's a few very important elements to venture building. And the first one is really the one that we talked about or touched upon at the top, the recognition that only because I, as a big established corporate, am good at the game that I'm currently playing, that doesn't make me in any way good at the game of innovating and coming up with new business models, and B, launching and growing those business models, right? And that recognition that recognition needs to lie at the core of everything you're doing on the venture building side. And that leads to governance being a very, very important element of making venture building a success, i.e. setting up a venture building unit the right way, making sure it gets enough budget, it gets enough senior leadership attention, ideally CEO attention, and making sure that the management practices that are applied within that unit are very different from how the core business is run. That means obviously completely different attitude to risk taking, at least on a project level, completely different time horizons, completely different measurement of what success means, right? Success in new business models isn't, oh, how much profit have we made in the first 6 months, in the first year? The kind of business models that deliver profit in the first 6 months are usually not the type of business models that will really drive incredible scale and revenues that make a difference to billion-dollar companies in 5-6 years down the line, right? Appreciating that and understanding that and safeguarding the venture building unit from the tendencies of a core organization through the right corporate governance setup is definitely one of the very, very important elements in how you want to set up your corporate venture building unit. And then the other thing is really a lot of the lessons that you get from startup building and from entrepreneurship, right? And startup building is much less, and this is something that Eric Ries says in his Lean Startup, right? It's much less a process of creativity and we all need to be the trailblazers and very creative minds. No, it's very process driven, and I think Eric Ries says something along the lines of, it's the boring stuff that matters when you build a startup, right? It's the processes, it's the thinking about how to go about it very methodologically, and optimizing not for what Eric Ries terms kind of what does he call them? Vanity metrics. So quick revenues, quick profits, no, optimizing for learning and understanding the market, understanding the customer, and building the basis for building something that is really huge, right? So processes is a big one. And then the last one is really thinking about venture building in a portfolio approach. So being aware that, again, and you get these learnings from the startup world and from the VC world, you will never be able to just pick the winner and invest and build up one business and invest in one startup, and that solves all your problems. That is not how it works. Even the best VC funds write off most of their investments because the investments they make turn out to be the wrong ones. And this is the best VC funds, right? We're not even talking about we're talking about the average VC funds here. And as a corporate, you need to just be aware that you can never solve for, oh, I only want to build winners. That is never going to happen. If you build a portfolio, if you start with 10 startups, 8 of them are most likely going to fail, and 2 of them are ideally going to pay more than the whole portfolio back, so to say, right? And this is this goes to some of the misunderstandings, a lot of the misunderstandings around startups in general, right? And I think one of the really interesting metrics when looking at later startup success is kind of at the seed stages, is how different opinions are about the future success of a particular venture, right? The most successful startups in the long term are often those where investors really couldn't agree, and some investors really thought this was a completely dumb idea, it's never going to work, and others were really taken by it. And that kind of culture of accepting that there is going to be a lot of failure along the way on a project level, not on a portfolio level, but on a project level. That is something that kind of, if you want to drive successful venture building, needs to be instilled in the leadership from day one.
But you mentioned 2 things. First, they need to be humble enough to say that we cannot do it as we've done till now. So we're successful in that, but not in doing another thing, which is venture building. That's one thing. And second one is thinking more like a VC, more like taking the stakes, thinking about how risky is everything. And it's like a different way of thinking. It's like betting bets, and one of them will work, which is very different than the usual C-level way of thinking. So how would they really manage? They are still there. They're still managing it. So how do you get these 2 things, which is like being risky, or most of them are risk averse, so more risky, and more humble, which is like, I think, not a common thing for a C-level management, right?
Yeah.
as I know them, maybe just in Israel.
No, I think that's probably and I think most CEOs would agree with your assessment of that, right? I think, to be honest, that the point around humbleness, that's probably an easier one, and maybe COVID has even helped with that, right? I think more and more companies and leadership of companies appreciate that innovation has to be on top of their agenda, and not in the kind of innovation theater way that you alluded to earlier, but like in a serious way, and seriously approaching innovation as something that must be a key priority for years to come. So I'm not, generally speaking, if you look at the state of things, I'm not too worried about the humbleness point. I'm more worried about the kind of attitudes towards risk. And the point that, and you called it bets just now, which is true, right? On a like project level, these are bets, but calling it bets is not going to go down too well with
No.
your average CEO or CFO, right?
Yeah, of course.
But this is, in some ways, this is a kind of short-sighted way of thinking about risks, right? Because first of all, the one thing you have to appreciate is, yes, this is of course risky. Anything we do in innovation is risky, but we can be very good at managing those risks on a portfolio level. We can also be good at trying to be smart about managing risks on a project level, but you'll never be able to eliminate the risk. And as a matter of fact, you don't want to eliminate the risk, because only with significant risk can you ever get high or significant rewards, right? But even if you ignore that, the risk of doing nothing is usually much higher than the risk of doing something. And it's the kind of risk that is a bit easier to swallow, because doing nothing is, no one's going to point the finger at you directly and say, on this day you did something wrong because you didn't initiate the innovation program. And it's always the case that you can say, I can wait another quarter, and no one's really going to be mad at you for that. And you might be afraid that people are mad at you if you build something that then fails, right? And this is just this is relatively basic psychology, and this is the stuff Kahneman partly talks about as well. But the risk point is really, this is the important one, and this is the one that is tricky about the discussion. But they're kind of making the key stakeholders see that the risk of doing nothing is actually much larger than the risk of taking a few bets that might fail. And if you're smart about the way you take those bets, and if you take enough bets and are smart enough about also cutting down on the bets that don't work, and being very happy to pull out of things very quickly when you get any sort of indication that this is not going the way you wanted, and not being too married to an idea that you've had and that you've fallen in love with, and just moving on to the next thing, and really thinking about the success on a portfolio level only, not on a project level, that makes it, I think, easier to accept risk in that way and in that form.